Hey, thanks for listening to The Mentionables. I'm Joel Furches. The audio that you're about to hear is an interview that I did with Mentionable Adam Coleman for his show, the TRU ID podcast. Adam has been part of the team since day one, but you've never heard him on this podcast because he already is involved in 2 podcasts of his own. Adam's a busy guy, but he's a valuable addition to the team. You can hear some from Adam in the conference episodes that we're going to be airing on this podcast. In the meantime, sit back and enjoy the interaction between myself, Joel Furches, and Adam Coleman of TRU ID.
Woo! Trying to find my way, 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 trying to find my way. I'm trying, change me.
My faith is in God alone, beyond a reasonable doubt. This brainstorm, pouring rain on your season of drought. Just trying to lay a couple seeds in the mouth. Thanks for listening. You ever get the feeling you was missing it?
What up, y'all? It's your hometown hero, Scott Lane, the Black Bruce Wayne, a.k.a. the real Adam Coleman. So, you riding with TRU ID. It's good to be back at y'all, man. One thing that I'm very serious about is exposing people to the various apologetics resources that are out there. You know, one thing that I see is just a terrible travesty, I think, is that, you know, all throughout the church, we have folks who just really are unaware of the various resources that are out there, people who are out here doing the work and answering some of the tough questions. And so what I want to do, I want to bridge the gap between my listeners and the folks who are out here doing it, man. So I've got a guy, definitely a great dude here today, man, is going to give us some information and really just talk about what apologetics means to the church. So without further ado, here he's got a serious message for the churches. Welcome to the show, my man, Joel Furches. How you doing there, brother?
I'm great. How are you, Adam?
I'm doing great, man. Doing great. Well, it's good to finally have you on the show, man. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked the first time. I was blown away by your ministry. You're doing a lot there, and it's such a pleasure and privilege of being on your show.
Oh, man, you're making me sound good, man. Like, I
well,
appreciate
somebody's got to, right? Your show.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That $5 I promise you came in handy. So, there you go. So yeah, man, Just, tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you got going on.
Well, I'm a great many things, but, right now I'm an apologetics writer and author. I write for a number of different publications, and have over the years. I got my start with the Examiner, which has went belly up at about 2016. And so now I write for Christian Media Magazine. I've done some work for Premier Christianity Magazine in the UK. A lot of people know their show, Unbelievable.
Sure.
And I write for Hub Pages as well. I got my own thing going on the side, but we'll talk about that.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. So actually, I wasn't aware you write for Hub Pages. How's that been going? So that kind of gives you, I guess, kind of a foothold into public spaces outside of just the church world, right? Is that right? Or
yeah, absolutely. The article I wrote about you appeared in Hub Pages.
Oh, awesome! Actually, that's pretty awesome, man. Hey, look, I'm somewhat famous. That's pretty cool. But so what got you into apologetics, man? How'd you get into it?
Well, much like yourself, I believe I grew up in the church, and I grew up in as much of a Christian bubble as you could possibly get. I went to a Christian school. I was raised in a Christian home. I went to a church. The church was inside my school. And I lived way back in the country, so no neighbors around. Everybody I, interacted with was a Christian. So in one sense, that was good. I don't have a dramatic conversion story, but I don't mind my childhood and what I grew up with. And the thing it gave me was a lot of familiarity with Scripture. I had Bible at home, had Bible at school, had Bible at church. I was getting it 3 ways to Sunday, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Right. No pun intended, right? Okay.
Yeah, well, kind of. But so then surprisingly, I suppose, I went to a Christian college. The downside of all that was that I wasn't getting any pushback on my faith. I was inside the bubble. I didn't know what was outside of the bubble. So I went to a Christian college, and that's where I started to get a little pushback, at least with what I'd grown up with, because the college was more into the more modern critical methods for the Bible. So that was the first time I started to hear that, the Pentateuch wasn't authored by Moses. The Bible wasn't necessarily inspired. It was probably based on Babylonian myths, and so on and so forth. And that kind of blew me out of the water. I didn't even know that stuff was out there. So at that point, I got a little desperate for some kind of resources to answer the questions I had, because I wasn't willing to accept what the college said. But if I didn't have anything to back up my beliefs, what choice did I have?
Sure.
And so I was attracted to apologetics because the intellectual aspect. I'd like to think I'm kind of an analytical thinker. I've got more intellect aspects. And so, in the church, you get a lot of your emotional needs met, but not necessarily the intellectual ones. And apologetics kind of came in and filled that gap. After college, I worked a lot of places, but eventually I discovered podcasts, and I tried to think about what I'd want to listen to, and I started listening to apologetics. One of the shows I listened to was from a guy named Jim Warner Wallace. You know that guy?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, it was after listening to him, I got on the message board on his page. At that time, he was doing a ministry called Please Convince Me. You remember that?
Actually, I've heard him mention that, but I wasn't familiar with it at the time when he was doing it.
That was a little bit before his cold case Christianity days.
Right.
At any rate, I got on that website and ran into an atheist, and he starts hitting me with atheist stuff, and I start trying to refute it. And I'd listened to a lot of apologetics by then, so I thought, I'll start a blog, do some apologizing of my own. So,
right. Okay.
Yep. So that started, and then almost immediately after that, I was looking for some freelance writing jobs, and I ran into this organization called The Examiner. They had a unique perspective on how to do news. What they did was they just hired freelance writers all over the country, and then they had a catalog of subjects to write about, and they had everything in that catalog. So you had some examiners that were following, like, say, Ron Paul, one specific politician, and that was all they wrote about. You had writing about supernatural, you had them writing about celebrities, just everything. So I started searching through the catalog, see if I could find a subject that I'd be able to write about all the time, and lo and behold, Christian apologetics comes up. Now, I had just started my blog, and I was like, well, why not get paid to do what I'm doing for free right now?
Right.
So I did that. And I guess that was probably how I fell into apologetics. Writing for them got me involved eventually in writing for a publication called Bible Translation Magazine. That didn't last very long, but I started getting invited to things and entering to networks and so forth because apparently I was doing okay a job at writing about it. So eventually my church says that they'd like some kind of youth class for college and career age. And I'm thinking, what better for college and career than apologetics? That's what you need when you start going into the workplace or the schools when you're going to get pushback on your faith.
Sure.
So I wanted to adopt Jim Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity, for a class, but for some reason I couldn't do it, so I ended up writing my own class. And that became the first book I published, titled Christ-Centered Apologetics. The philosophy behind that book is this. I wanted to give these kids one argument that they could memorize and learn. So I thought to myself, what is the single argument that you could use for apologetics? And I thought, well, you could bring God into the picture. You could do cosmological argument, moral argument, all that stuff, and get people to start believing in God. But the ultimate goal is to get them to believe in Christ.
Sure.
God is revealed through Christ. But on the other hand, if I can just talk Christ, not only have I proved the existence of God, if Jesus rose from the dead and he claimed to be God, then God exists. But not only that, if you successfully give an argument for Christ, you haven't just done apologetics, you've done evangelism. You've preached the gospel in doing apologetics. And so that's why I named it Christ-centered apologetics.
Gotcha.
Just like everything else, all around the person of Christ. So that's pretty much how I got into apologetics.
Awesome, man. You know what? It's interesting you should say that. So I was at this conference, it's called the Frequency Conference.
I saw you talk about that.
Yeah, man, I had a blast, man. Shout out to Eric Mason, And so I was talking to some guys in the hallway, and this kind of came up, and I think you kind of hit on it. Maybe I'll kind of get your thoughts. But, while I think that there can be conversation where you're just kind of watering that seed or maybe sowing a seed in somebody, it seems to me that sometimes apologists kind of on their own stop short of just preaching the gospel where the opportunity might be there. I mean, do you think that's the case? I mean, do you feel like sometimes we just don't go far enough? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's entirely possible because it's uncomfortable. You get into a groove. Your groove is arguing with atheists. Something takes you outside of that groove. And suddenly what are you supposed to do? Your arguments against atheists, the thing you've learned, either you've exhausted it or it doesn't fit the occasion. And so, again, that does tie back because if your argument against atheists is the same as your preaching of the gospel, if they're one and the same, then you're prepared. You're ready to go.
Right. Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, it's so fascinating because I agree with you that in some ways, and I could be wrong about this, but in some ways I think that you can get so much into apologetics that you underappreciate the power of the gospel itself. And one thing I like about that Ravi Zacharias always says, or that I've heard him say, is that apologetics is kind of like the salt and the pepper, like the seasoning, whereas the gospel itself is the steak and potatoes. I probably modified that somewhat, but somewhere along those lines, that sentiment there, and I think that's kind of what you're communicating. I completely agree. Now, the mentionables, right? Yeah. I know that's something you got popping off now, man. Tell us about that. Tell us, what is the mentionables?
Okay. Well, that's a great story. I love this because it keeps unfolding even better. So I'm into apologetics. I've been into apologetics for a while. And as anybody who's been into apologetics starts to think, I'm sure you've had this thought yourself, I should do a conference. I should do an apologetics conference. Now,
I've had the thought, but
you're way more connected than I am, but I knew a couple of guys, Jim Wallace being one of them. He and I connected him up with him back in the Please Convince Me days. He was one of the first people I interviewed for my column. So I've got his phone number. I've got his name. We know each other. And I was thinking, I got at least one guy I could get out for a conference. But as time went by, I started to think, well, you get into apologetics, you start networking. And I had been invited to all these different networks. I joined some groups, and I started running into the same people over and over again that were doing the same kind of thing I was. They were doing apologetics, but they weren't big-name apologists. They weren't traveling around to conferences. They weren't getting paid to do it. They were just bloggers or podcasters or whatnot. But just the fact that they were amateurs doesn't mean that they were amateurish. They had good arguments. They had a good voice. They knew what they were doing. They just didn't have a platform. And so I started thinking, instead of getting Jim Wallace or Ravi Zacharias or somebody like that out, I should get out these guys that have a great voice. They just don't have the platform. I would get them out. We'd do a conference together, and I'd call them the Mentionable because they deserve a little mention.
Sure.
And this is just a daydream I've got floating through my mind. Not a serious thought because I don't know how to run a conference. I'd never set anything up. I'm just a guy in a church who writes freelance columns. But it's a fun daydream to have. So then this summer, two things happened to me. First of all, I underwent a medical procedure that made me questioned whether or not I was going to go back to work. I might have to stay home. The other thing that happened to me was that I finished my second book, and I had given it to my book agent to start shopping around to publishers. Well, firstly, my book agent got some rejections from publishers, and one of the reasons that they would reject me is that my name wasn't big enough. They didn't think I could push the books. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I didn't think I was going to be able to return to work, or at least I suspected I might not be able to. So I decided there's only one thing to do. I got to get my name out there. I got to raise my online profile. Mm-hmm. So maybe I can get more freelance writing so that becomes my full-time job. And secondly, so that if my name's more recognizable, maybe a publisher will pick my book up. Who knows? So I did that, and I started my own website as an author, and I began a Facebook group with my name on it, and there are various things, a couple of blogs, different things like that to try to raise the profile. Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is, if you're going to keep social media running, you got to keep posting.
Yeah.
So you start to just post whatever you can. And at one point, I was like, well, I could post my little daydream about the Mentionables. So I did. I posted on my group, and I tagged a couple of people that I had been thinking about for the conference. If I ever started it, these were the guys I was going to invite. Mm-hmm. And that first post, these guys came in, and they started talking. And at first, everybody was joking. You were on that post, Adam. You know what happened.
Absolutely, yeah. Right.
It was a big joke, but it kept going, and it kept getting more serious. So I thought, hey, this is just one thread, and it's getting really long. There's a lot of comments on here. I just started a Facebook group for the Mentionables, and we can keep the conversation going. Well, I screwed up. I didn't make a Facebook group. I made a Facebook page. Mm-hmm. Difference being a page is the face of, say, a business or some kind of project. So that was an accident, but I put it up. And then suddenly we had the page, we had a Twitter feed, and the guy, and then I told a friend, because this thing kept snowballing, I was kind of excited about it, so I told a friend of mine who lives in North Carolina. Next day, he's arranged a conference for us. Accidental. I didn't do that. He did it for us. So now I've accidentally created a Facebook page. What became a joke is becoming more and more serious, and now we've got a conference for it.
Yep, absolutely.
So I kept getting other people trying to get into the group. I had 6 people at this point, and I thought, if you're going to do conferences and stuff, 6 is a lot of people to do. So I had to figure out what to do. I didn't want to turn people down, but at the same time, I wanted to keep things reasonable, so I started the network. The network is a little bit different than a conference speaking team. It's all comers, small-time apologists, bloggers, podcasters, whoever. Mm-hmm. You sign. We're going to get you into the network. We're going to put you in a catalog of small-time apologists. You're going to tell us what kind of strengths and what you bring to the table. You're going to tell us what needs you have, what kind of things you want from the network. We're going to start hooking you up. I got people all over the map. If a ministry opportunity comes up, I can activate near that and send them out, and they can, we have people all over the map to do that.
Right.
And you described this as a grassroots movement. Well, Adam, this is a grassroots movement that started itself. Every turn has been sort of this coincidence that just became a thing. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. There was an apologetics conference that was started close to where I am. So I asked them, and they allowed me to set up a table for the Mentionable. So we have 3 authors in the group so far, and we're going to sell all 3 books out at the table and represent ourselves. Well, another member of the team was nearby, so he and I went together. And before this thing started, somebody on Facebook who had been following us works for Xerox, and he contacts me and says, I can get you anything for free. So I sent over some formats templates that I'd worked up for, flyers and business cards and things. About 3 days later, 5-pound box arrives in the mail. Open it up, professional flyers and business cards, all of it for free. He just sent me.
Right.
Just fallen into my lap. I didn't ask for it. Somebody volunteered it, and it came. And that's been this entire venture. What was a daydream has become a real thing. Step of the way, like here's one. One of the guys I tagged just stopped responding after this thing started becoming serious. Well, I wanted like 4 guys in the group, and at that point we'd only have the 3. So I found another guy that I'd known for a while who dabbled, and asked him if he wanted to join. Well, this guy's a professional voice artist. He does voiceovers and commercials and audiobooks. He says we should have a podcast. He's got all of the audio equipment. Suddenly we've got a podcast.
Right.
Just recently, that's turned into a regular live cast that we're calling Mentionable TV. Again, things just keep snowballing, and it just live. And you know what that means, Adam? When everything just kind of starts happening, and you're not making it happen.
Yep. I'm with you. And what's interesting about that is, and this is why I wanted you to tell the story, because it's so fun. What's funny about it, it really mirrors kind of my own story, how I got into apologetics. A lot of times people trip off of the intro that I have, where I call myself the hometown hero, Scott Lane, the black person. I kind of run it down. And I don't think I've ever actually explained like why I call myself the hometown hero. And it's actually, kind of ties in here because, when I first started this show, when I was about to start the show rather, my thinking was I want people who are just everyday Christians, right? To be empowered to feel as though, hey, that they can make a difference, in their communities, whether it be social media or what have you, that I can equip them with information and they can go out and really minister to people. And they don't have to be a PhD. They don't have to be, some philosophical, genius or something like that to actually go out and make a difference. Because that's not my testimony. I don't have 25 PhDs or anything like that, but I invest time in God's word. I invest time in studying the things that He leads me to study, and then I go out and I minister as best I can with apologetics, and I try to empower other people to do the same. So I'm just like everybody else. You know what I'm saying? I'm nothing special per se, and that's kind of why I call myself the hometown hero. And, it was so interesting is, going back to, something you said earlier is that you contacted me actually, pretty early on from when I started the show.
Really?
Yeah, definitely. I had a couple episodes under my belt and I was writing articles and, I was really just kind of getting started. And then I remember you hit me up in my email and, or on Facebook rather, it was like an offer to write an article about what I'm doing. And the thing about it is it was so, I was taken aback about it, quite frankly, because I was like, man, somebody actually cares, like what I'm doing. I was like, oh, wow, because it's so easy for me to sit here and record a podcast. I'm talking into a microphone, but it's like, oh, wow, somebody's actually paying attention,
Yeah.
And so that was pretty cool. And I remember you released it last February. And so that's why when you posted about the mentionables and shared the idea that you had, I was definitely on board because I understand the value of the fact. I mean, everybody can't be William Lane Craig. Everybody can't be some international world traveling whatever he would consider himself to be. The reality is
Lane Craig, man.
Well, yeah, right.
Speak 5 languages. Write 30 books.
Right. I'm not even close, man. I'm not even close to it, But that's the thing, that's honestly, that's just not the way that God set up the church. You know what I'm saying? God did not, create the church with like this celebrityism in mind. You know what I'm saying? When God, when Jesus, commissioned the apostles, the idea is that everybody would put their hand to the plow and share the gospel in whatever context that they found themselves in, going out into the world, preaching the gospel. That's the way the body of Christ is supposed to function. You don't have to have a big name to be effective, for the gospel, and I think that's really the heart of, the mentionables. And that's why I wanted you to come on the show to really share, what that's all about. Now, transitioning a little bit, I know that, you got a real passion for, equipping the church and really what it, I guess, kind of stressing to the church the importance of apologetics, because unfortunately, a lot of folks still haven't caught on yet, as to why apologetics is so necessary. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of, what is the necessity? I think I would consider a necessity. Why is it so necessary today to be skilled in apologetics?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why that's so, but I'd like to focus on one thing that I think gets overlooked a lot. And I'll tie this back into, we were talking about this before we started recording, some of my background in psychology. So if you've trafficked in the world of apologetics, or, just on Facebook and you're a Christian, you'll start to see this a lot. Articles come up that say that atheists are more intelligent than Christians.
Yeah, and, right.
Yeah, they'll release these studies that have been done, where they link intelligence and academics and so forth to atheism. And then another thing you'll see a lot related to this is that your average religious person is an intuitive thinker, meaning that they react rapidly on gut feelings rather than sit down and consider things, and that your average atheist is going to be an analytical thinker, which is the opposite. They sit and consider things before they make decisions. So I looked into this, and I have a background both in psychology and education. And in education, very recently, they've had this idea of multiple intelligences, where like people don't just think one way. Different people think different ways, and education should target all types of thought, because otherwise people get left in the dust. Mm-hmm. Well, the people getting left in the dust are the intuitive thinkers, the people who are more feelers than thinkers, who make rapid decisions and don't. The analytical thinkers, they do great in school. They accelerate, they go into other grades. Doesn't mean they're any smarter. It just means that based on the stuff you judge on the grade paper, they're doing better.
Sure.
The way school operates. Well, the analytical thinkers, they get rewarded in school because their type of thought accelerates in school. They get a lot of good grades, and that becomes a reward for their type of thought. It's a punishment for your intuitive thinkers. They're not as good. They don't get the grades. Mm-hmm. But you know what does reward the intuitive thinkers is church. You get a lot of your intuitive needs met in church. Those feelings that you have, the church stands there to meet those. Worship, it's all about intuition. It gives you that emotional high. It gives you the comfort and peace. Nothing against that, but you don't get that kind of reward in school. Therefore, you've got this separation going. You've got your analytical thinkers are excelling in the academics. Now, you could make the argument, and I do, that the higher you get up in the academics, the more flack you get against religion, and the more they stress, say, secularism and naturalism, that kind of thing.
Sure, right.
So my argument is that the academy manufactures atheists, and therefore your more analytical thinkers, the people who did better in school, are the ones who are more likely to be atheists because that's the system they're getting pulled into. Your intuitive thinkers are more likely to be religious because religion appeals to intuition. It appeals to the feelings. So your analytical thinker goes into church, they're not getting their needs met. Their deep thought, their need to really put some consideration into things and sit down and analyze things, that's just not being met in the church for the most part.
Right.
The church is further away from that. So what service does apologetics offer in the church? A lot. But one thing it offers is it brings in those analytical thinkers. That's why it's been so effective against atheism, is because if atheists are analytical thinkers and you give them apologetics, that gives them something to consider. That appeals to the analytical style in the way that your worship music and other things the church does can't do. Mm-hmm. So if the church can meet the needs of both your analytical and your intuitive thinkers, it's a well-rounded institution. It's not just targeting one kind of person.
Now, see, that's interesting what you just said right there. You said that it's a well-rounded institution, right? Now, I think what's interesting about that is, in other words, there's nothing wrong with the gospel. There's nothing wrong with what the Christian worldview has to offer. The issue is we're packaging it in such a way that we're in a sense we have one arm tied behind our backs. You know, one thing that I tell people all the time is when you look at just the intellectual history of the church. I mean, you go back to the church fathers, you go back to just thinkers in general, particularly in the Western world who draw from the Christian worldview. I mean, there's no shortage of deep intellectual thought in Christian heritage. But unfortunately, we've handicapped ourselves. And then we wonder why, folks are leaving the church. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I'll be talking to somebody who, they grew up in church and they used to grandma's church with all the hooping and hollering and all that kind of stuff. And then they go off to college, they take that philosophy 101 course that appeals to that, I think it's left brain, that analytical side. And then when they go back home to their home church, they can't relate anymore.
Yeah.
They found something different and now they can't relate. And it's like, okay, well, I don't want anything to do with that. If I've got to turn my brain off, when I enter the church door, then of course I don't want to have anything to do with it. I'm going back to what Professor so-and-so said, and that's where they are. And so I think you're right that apologetics is crucial in that you give, people who think that way, people who are oriented towards maybe the logical side, at that aspect of the human experience, you give them somewhere to fit in, so to speak, within the church experience. Does that sound about right? Or
yes, sir. People tend to think that apologetics is for one thing alone. It's for fighting atheists. And that's not true at all. It's a defense of your beliefs. You construct a reason for what you believe. Now, your reason may be how it makes you feel, the feels that it gives you, but that doesn't apply to everyone. A good apologetic is something that is true regardless of who you're talking to, not just one person and how they feel. I want to make it clear right now, I am not against the feelings, the worship, those things. Like you said and like I said, the church should be well-rounded. It should have equal intellect as it does to intuition. Equal thinking as feeling. Jesus said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Got three things combined there, and none of them should be neglected. So the church was the seat of intellect for years. You look in the universities, they were run by the church. All the major universities in America were originally founded by the church. Then, around the time of the Great Enlightenment, they started drifting away from that. And then you had the Great Revival, which brought a lot of people back, but it did so in this emotional sense. No longer was the church serving both needs. They were separated at that point.
Now, I feel like I'm going to, be stereotype here a little bit, but would you agree that this is especially a problem when it comes to keeping men in the church? Like, would you, or at least, keeping men interested, or no, actually, I don't think that's right. Keeping men in the church. I mean, just not appealing to this analytical side. I mean, do you think that's fair to say, or?
I think it is fair to say, because if you look at the studies, men tend to be more analytical and women tend to be more intuitive. I'm citing studies here. That's not just me saying stuff. This is stuff you could look up and it's documented. B, like I've already said, your average atheist is going to be more analytical and your average Christian is going to be more intuitive. And C, there are more women in the church than there are men.
Sure, right.
So, is that a coincidence? I can't say it is. That seems to just line up with the facts. So you're absolutely right. Your men are more likely to leave, and they're more likely to be analytical. It all lines up.
It all lines up, man. Absolutely, absolutely. So, I want to switch gears here a little bit. In the type of thing that I do, there's a particular issue that I think crops up all the time, man. And you've done some work on this, and philosophers refer to it as the problem of evil, Now, I know you've done a lot of thinking on this, and a lot of times it's posed as, why do bad things happen to good people? Or, people might cite certain, particularly morally objectionable things like slavery and things of that nature. Talk a little bit about the work that you've done in regard to the problem of evil And, maybe help us think through that a little bit, because I think that that's one of those things that people really struggle with, but find a hard time, maybe in the moment responding to people who raise those sorts of objections.
Sure. So when I did my first class on apologetics in my church, I had this habit of, at the end of the class, trying to take people's questions related to apologetics. What kind of things do they run into? What kind of objections do they have trouble answering? Very first day I did the class, very first question, what do I tell atheists about the problem of evil and suffering? What am I supposed to tell them? At that point, I realized this was the next thing I was going to teach about, because that's the big question you're going to run into. And it's not an atheist problem. It's an everyone problem. Just becoming a Christian doesn't mean you don't have questions about why God would allow such and such. It doesn't mean that you can suddenly explain away, say, the command to destroy the Canaanites, for instance. Those are still problems for Christians, just like they are non-Christian. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It didn't take a lot of work for me to start the class that I was going to teach on the problem of evil, because if you've been in apologetics long, that's most of what you're going to end up talking about. These objections that you hear, I mentioned the Canaanite thing. That's going to be one that most apologists are going to have to answer at some point. That's a problem of evil question. Why does God let people starve in Africa? That's an apologetics question. Sure. And eventually all of these start coming together, and they're one big ball of problem of suffering, problem of evil. What are you going to do with it all? So I sat down to plan that class, and turns out I had already written a lot of the stuff that I needed to address in that issue. Well, similar to my book, this Christ-Centered Apologetics, the central answer to the question is the person of Christ. There's a lot of stuff there, but your typical doctrine will say that free will. God gave humans free will, because if it didn't, then love wouldn't be love, because they'd be required to by their nature. So humans exercised free will, and there was a falling out with God. I try to generalize that because I don't like to have to go back and defend a particular view of Scripture or creation or anything like that in order to frame my argument. But it's pretty easy to say that people are fallen. People do bad things. There's not a lot of argument to be made there.
Yeah, just watch the news, obviously.
Exactly.
We talk about these mass shootings and whatever, yeah.
Seriously. So you don't necessarily have to have Eve and an apple to get a fallen humanity. It's there. It's very clear. Mm-hmm. And if God is real and God is God, then he's a lot more perfect than people are. And people have to answer to him for their actions. So right there you have the problem that the Bible seeks to address in the person of Christ. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, the question, why does God allow bad things to happen to people? What does God owe people? Does God owe people a good life? If something's uncomfortable or unpleasant, does that make it evil? Or if something is uncomfortable and unpleasant, but it brings about something good, it would be evil for it not to happen. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you've got a lot of this. It's a wrong presumption. People assume that if they don't like something, therefore it's evil. But who determines evil? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that would be the start of my answer. The next thing is, how do we determine what is good and what's bad? Well, okay, so let's take a look at the tabloids that you see lining the grocery counter as you go to check out your groceries. Here you have a lot of famous, attractive, rich people doing nothing but complaining about their lives.
Yeah, true, yeah.
In terms of, say, comfort and amenities, these people have it all, but they're not happy. So, on the other hand, you have people dying in the hospital who are living fulfilled lives. They're surrounded by loved ones. They feel accomplished. So your position in terms of comfort and worldly goods do not necessarily have anything to do with your personal fulfillment. So it becomes a question of purpose. If I have what they call existential fulfillment, meaning that my existence is fulfilled, then that should be the ultimate goal. That should be the highest goal. So what's the goal of existence? What could cause existential fulfillment?
Mm-hmm.
To me, that would be having some kind of purpose in glorifying God. So you look at Scripture, God has two very specific characteristics that he displays over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
One is his justice, his holiness, his perfection. And this is the part that comes off as unpleasant in the Bible a great deal. God does a lot of judgy things. He's very judgmental. And this is the God that nobody likes because he takes out his judgment on people who deserve that judgment. And it seems kind of unpleasant. But the other part of God's nature is his mercy, his forgiveness. Now, if you think about it for a second, those two things seem like they're opposed to one another. One of the statements that God makes in the Pentateuch, I think probably Exodus, that he says this, that he is a gracious and forgiving God, but he also will by no means clear the wicked and deliver justice on the third and fourth generation. And in one statement, in one verse there, you have it say that God is loving and forgiving and God is holy and just. And the two just seem like opposite statements. So then you have two aspects of God that can be revealed in a human life, regardless of how that human, whether that human likes it or not. If they're rebellious against God and God is just, exercises his justice on them, then that person has had existential fulfillment because they've violated God's justice. They've done something with their life, or their life has done something to show an aspect of God's nature.
Sure.
Reveal this aspect of God's nature. On the other hand, if a person asks for forgiveness and is forgiven by God, they've highlighted another aspect of God's nature. In their existence, they've revealed something about God, one or the other. So how do we balance, or how do we reconcile these two seemingly opposite aspects of God's nature? And that was done in Jesus Christ. Jesus came and sacrificed himself and absorbs God's justice. In so doing, God's justice was exercised in his life. But he also lived a perfect life and transferred the grace and mercy of God that should have been his to us. Anybody who is willing to accept it, God's grace is available for them. So Jesus is the only person who's ever lived who satisfied both God's justice and God's mercy. That seeming contradiction in God's nature was resolved in Jesus Christ, and he made that grace available to everyone. Mm-hmm. So, suffering and evil, it's a problem, but that problem was reconciled in Christ. I was saying this to my brother today. In Christ, you had a solution to both problems. You had a solution to evil because Christ reconciled evil with God and made his grace available to us so that we can be perfected in his nature. The other problem, he conquered death. In his resurrection, he overcame death so that anybody who chooses to may receive both forgiveness of their sins and a perfection through Christ's nature and eternal life because he conquered death. So the problem of evil is reconciled in the person of Christ. And no matter how miserable my life may be, if I have highlighted some aspect of God's nature, which I will inevitably will do, then my existence has been given fulfillment.
Yeah, see, that's so fascinating to me because I think one thing that I find as Christians, we often, take on the problem of evil when somebody might ask, like I said, something like before, where somebody might ask a question, well, why did God allow, the Holocaust or slavery, or, why is there all this evil in the world? And we feel as though like we're the only ones who have to answer that question, when in reality, any worldview, anybody who holds to a worldview has to wrestle with that question and give an account for it in a way that aligns with the reality and is internally consistent, you know. And I think, when I hear you talking about it, one thing I hear what you're saying is taking the different pieces of the biblical worldview and demonstrating how Christianity provides an answer to the problem of evil that, where it's like some people say sin doesn't win, evil doesn't win. And it's also internally consistent. There's nothing hanging outside of the box, so to speak. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I think that's the advantage, when it comes to answering the problem of evil, if we're well versed in how to respond to those things, that's the advantage that we have over other worldviews, because they can't give an answer that aligns with reality and is internally consistent, I'm gonna leave out with this. Like, would you agree? I mean, I guess, do you think that we're often too quick to respond to the problem of evil? I mean, do you, like, when you're in conversations, do you put kind of pressure on the other person to hold their way to the conversation too and account for it from their perspective? Or do you find it just more effective to, give the Christian response and then kind of let it hang where it is?
I I have tried. I can remember a conversation I had very recently about the problem of evil. And of course, with a little experience, I tried to hold the other person accountable. I tried to, start with, well, what you're saying to me is that we have some rights that God violates when he allows bad things to happen to us. So where do those rights come from? Well, immediately what I got back, and this is what makes the problem of evil such a difficult one, is the emotional response. They weren't interested in, even considering what I had just asked. They're asking, well, why did God allow my mother to have a miscarriage? I never got to know my older sister because she never existed. How could God let this happen? And, again, I come back with, well, what you're telling me is that your sister's life had some kind of value that was robbed from her by being miscarried. Where does that value come from? And again, I got, well, what kind of God would allow my sister to be? Again, it's all emotion, and that's the power of the argument from evil, is that no matter how much the person may be flawed in their thinking, their emotions are right there, and nothing's going to remove that emotional force by just building some kind of logical argument.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so true, man. I mean, because like you spoke to earlier. I mean, there's different facets to who we are. How God created us. I mean, obviously there is the logical side, but then there's also the emotional piece too. Fairly recently, I was watching an interview with this a rapper his name is Styles P. Back in the day, he was like this thugged out dude, and he was known for just really putting a lot of violence in his raps, kind of being a tough guy. And so he was doing this interview, and he was talking about his daughter. I want to say his stepdaughter, unfortunately, committing suicide. As tragic as that is, and it was. I mean, he's on this nationally syndicated show, and he just breaks down crying. And to me, it was so interesting because, I felt bad for the guy, but it's like, man, I mean, to think this guy was the tough guy. At the same time, you see, at the end of the day, there's some realities to the human experience that are just inescapable. And I think the problem of evil and just bad things happening in the world is one of those inescapable realities. And I think one thing that we can, as Christians, we can look to is that we have an answer for a problem that everybody knows is real. Like, we all know this world is jacked up. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no question about that. We all know it. We all feel it. And what we find is that people out here in the world, they don't have an answer for it. And to your point, and I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but I think it's fascinating that among the industrialized nations, if I'm not mistaken, I think America has the highest rate for anxiety and depression, if I'm not mistaken, and I think that's very interesting. I mean, given the fact that we are so affluent as a nation,
Yeah.
and yet still, we have anxiety and depression is such a prominent issue in our society. I think it really speaks to the fact that man is really broken. Like this world is really jacked up, and you can't save yourself from that just by indulging. Well, I just put it that way: indulging in the material world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I often think about Christ in the wilderness when he's undergoing his temptations, and the very first thing that Satan says to him is, turn these rocks to bread. And Christ comes back with a man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Now, God originally said that, or the Bible originally says that in Deuteronomy, when Moses is talking to the generation about to enter the nation, and he's talking about their fathers in the wilderness, and he says that they were put in the wilderness to understand that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So what that has just done is it's placed the Word of God over physical necessity, over the very things that we need in order to live in the body. So why would one be more important than the other? Well, it doesn't matter how much food and drink you have, you're still going to die at some point. But if you have placed the importance of God's Word as top priority, assuming the Christian worldview, not only have you gotten an out from death, you've received eternal life, but you've also received a relationship with God, both of which are more valuable than simply feeding your body. In fact, the Bible often recommends fasting as a practice for penance or for prayer or so forth. But fasting, it's counterintuitive in the sense that it's rejecting the physical needs and placing the spiritual needs as more important. So what this tells me is what you were just saying, that no matter how much comfort and food and pleasure you're experiencing, you're not going to be satisfied until you attain to a relationship with God. This longing that we all feel inside, that, you hear this often, the God-shaped hole in our heart. There's some truth to that. Because no matter, again, I pointed out these celebrities in Hollywood, they've got everything. They've still got some kind of longing deep down for something else.
Right. And, and actually I want to bring it around, somewhat full circle, man. I mean, just like I said, I'm just talking here, but, you talked about earlier the importance of apologetics, not just for the world and for the unbelieving, atheists or whatever, but also for the church. And I got to be real, man. Like, when it comes to, addressing the problem of evil, for me, it's a very real question. And I'm kind of babbling here a little bit, but I say that because, and you know this, man. I mean, right at the beginning of 2017, I lost my dad. Unexpectedly. Very unexpectedly. I mean, he was a health nut. He ran, for 4 or 5 times a week. He was a vegan and so on and so forth. And he just, I mean, of anybody in the family, you would think that would go early, it wouldn't have been him. And then, I found myself having to deal with the reality that he's gone. And he was such a huge part of what I'm doing here, with TRU ID. I mean, the last conversation I had with my dad, I was on the phone, and he was just really proud of what I'm doing here with apologetics and stuff. He was just encouraging me, and the last words, and this is a blessing. Like the last thing I heard him say was, "Son, I love you." And that was the last time we spoke, man. And when he passed, I had studied on the problem of evil. I understood it intellectually. I understood the philosophical ins and outs, I guess, of how to answer that sort of objection when people bring up the problem of evil. But when my dad passed, it forced me to confront it myself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was no longer just a mental exercise. You know, I really had to grapple within myself with like, man, like, you know, this evil in the world is real.
Mm.
You know, my dad was a pastor, you know what I'm saying? He was out here doing a lot of great things, and boom, he's gone. Like that thing hit me, you know?
Yeah.
And it was one of those situations where, okay, you know, now I've got to put my money where my mouth is, you know? I talk about this stuff all the time. I'm constantly online, you know, preaching it to others.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm confronted with something to where, you know, I've got to apply and think through this thing in a way that's healthy. And, you know, the apologetics help with that, you know, but there was just a reality to it that wasn't there before.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that you said, you talked a little bit earlier about value. And one thing that really, I guess, kind of helped me to work through, you know, the situation with my dad is that when I thought about the atheistic worldview, right,
Mm-hmm.
like I could not, you know, bring myself to believe that ultimately my dad's life was worthless. You know, that was just the end. You know what I'm saying? Like he was just, he was here, he was gone, and that's it. You know, like to me, there was something completely inhuman about just denying the fact that, you know, my dad's life was worth something.
Uh-huh.
You know, like I said, I mean, the last words I heard him, you know, say was, "I love you, son." Like, you know, if the atheistic worldview is true, then love is meaningless ultimately, you know. And as I was really grappling with my dad's passing and just the weight of it, you know, I realized that, and this is not to say that just, you know, that you believe in God just because it makes you feel good, but as a worldview, as a, you know, atheism is an incomplete worldview that ultimately cuts against your own humanity. You know, you really have to look at life and death in an inhuman sort of way, you know. And to me, that just seemed, you know, just to go against all of our most basic intuitions about what life is about, you know. And so, you know, the idea that there is human value
Mm-hmm.
just was such a profound, became such a more profound reality to me, you know, in that instance, as I was kind of thinking through these things. And I said all that to say that, again, apologetics is not just something for the unbeliever, you know, but if you're able to think clearly through things and think biblically, you know, through the issues that you encounter in life, then in the life of a believer, I mean, that's invaluable, man. I mean, you just can't replace that. You know, apologetics has real world application and value in the life of the believer that just can't be overlooked or neglected. You know?
Yeah, especially when it comes to the problem of evil, you really do have to treat that emotional side. You can't leave that one neglected. So when I did my course, what became a manuscript for a book on problem of evil, I had to include sections on, you know, counseling. How do you deal with the evil in your own life? How do you deal with the problem of suffering with people around you? Because you're more likely to win somebody to Christ by ministering to their needs than you are by giving them arguments.
Absolutely.
It happens. And I mean, you know this, considering the type of work you've done, that the biggest power in a person's life is another person coming in and caring for them.
Oh, absolutely, man. And like, again, going back to my situation, I mean, like, you know, people rallying around me and, you know, getting emails from different people, you know, feeling like I was a part of a community that cared. I mean, all those things work together because, you know, God created us to be, you know, we're relational beings. Mm-hmm. You know, this is that old adage, no man is an island. And I think back to the book of Job. You know, Job had all these questions. I mean, he had his friends and him were kind of philosophizing about, you know, why he was in the predicament that he was in. But ultimately, it was a direct encounter with God. Mm-hmm. That's where the resolution came, you know. Mm-hmm. And so I think, again, when it comes to the problem of evil, you know, you have the logical aspect of the problem of evil that we could work through philosophically. And then there's the relational, emotional aspect of the problem of evil that, again, Christianity, you know, has an answer that other worldviews don't. Because honestly, if atheism is true, then if your life sucks, then oh well. You don't matter. Nothing matters, and nobody's coming to help you. But from a Christian perspective, you do have that resource within it, that not only God has instituted the body of believers, and within that fellowship of believers, you have, the resource to be able to kind of rebound from the troubles that we all face. But then also there's a very real God who wants a very real relationship with each of us, individually and corporately. And within the context of that direct relationship with him, like you talked about fasting, praying, and, praising God, worship, and so forth, those things aren't just exercises, right? Those things are very real ways in which God connects with mankind and resolves the type of things that we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Adam, you were just hitting home with me with the story about your father, because that's almost the exact same story I have, especially around the time that I started focusing on the problem of evil. I'm not going to, tell the whole details, but one day I'm at work and I get a call from my brother. Dad has cancer, and had a very good relationship with my dad. It was only a couple of weeks later that he died. But he and I were both really interested in doing this series on the problem of evil. And I got it done after he died. And that's when I started really writing about that and getting into it. And so I sent you over the manuscript for my book. The very last chapter talks about my dad's story, because if I was going to bring that story, if I was going to bring the problem of evil home, I was going to do it with my dad's story. And how everything you were just saying about your dad really hit home with me. I really relate to that.
Yeah. It's just one of those things. I mean, you just can't lighten it up. And I think that's, it's a very real thing that people deal with. And I think that apologetics is one aspect, in terms of helping people think through it. I think that's beneficial. And then, the other aspects of the Christian faith to deal with it, like you said, emotionally, really brings things together. And, I said that to say, as we kind of wrap it up, I said that to say that, as Christians, for all the listeners out there, we can't underestimate the fullness of what the Christian worldview has to offer. Like we talked about earlier, we need a well-rounded faith, so to speak. And when we don't, avail ourselves to all the different aspects of what the Christian worldview offers, then, people who have really serious questions out there, whereas we would be able to minister to those things, we find ourselves shorthanded, And so apologetics is not just something that, we use as a battering ram, with atheists or whoever it may be. It has real life application for believers as well. So, but yeah, with that said, man, just tell us a little bit about, how people can get in contact with you, access your work, and then we'll roll out like that.
Okay. Well, it's pretty easy to get in contact with me. I've got a website called joelfurches.com, just my first name and my last name.com.
Okay. Right.
And then for the Mentionables, which is the biggest thing I got going now, and it just keeps getting bigger. The website is thementionables.org. So,
there it is.
Pretty easy websites to remember, hopefully.
Absolutely, man. Hey, man, I appreciate you coming on the show, man, and definitely love the work that you're doing, bro. And I'm glad to be a part of it as a member of the Mentionables. And I'm definitely looking forward to the conference we got coming up in May in North Carolina and whatnot. I'll definitely be keeping my listeners posted on that. So, with that said, love you guys out there, man. That's another episode in the books.
All right. Peace. Thank you, man. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.
It all started with a small-time dream. Hold a conference in a church. With a small budget, could we afford to bring in a Christian celebrity speaker? And with an ear to hear more than just the same canned messages, do we want to? With these two questions, the Mentionables were born. We found the best under-the-radar Christian apologists that we could find. Writers, podcasters, and bloggers. Their voice was small, but their message was huge. On May 18th and 19th, the Mentionables will be appearing in Greensboro. Head out to Greensboro Christian Church and hear this grassroots phenomena in action. featuring talks and a great debate. Head over to thementionables.org to get your tickets, or call Greensboro Christian Church at 336-621-5226. The Mentionables. Small-time voices, big-time noise.